All right, so welcome everybody to our final All Souls seminar at home for the year. And with some luck, our final All Souls seminar at home ever, although I suspect we're going to be in a hybrid form in the new year. But today I'm very pleased to welcome Conor O'Reilly, who's going to be talking to us today. Conor is professor, I was going to say professional in transnational crime. You're a professor in transnational crime and security at Leeds School of Law, where he's also the program director for the MSc in Security, Conflict and Justice. Conor's recent work has focused on kidnapping in Mexico, and it is about that research which he will be presenting on today in his talk. We'll do the usual, which is that Conor will speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have about half an hour or so for questions. So Conor, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mary. And it's nice to be invited back, and it's nice to see a few people that I remember when it was back in Manor Road. So it was even in a different building when I was last in the centre. So it's nice. It's nice, and thanks for the opportunity. So I'll share the screen now, and hopefully this will open all right. It did a while ago. If you can't see it, shout, but hopefully that has now opened the screen for the seminar that I'm going to give on kidnapping in the US-Mexico borderlands, citizen responses, and the intimacy-distance paradox. And I'll explain a bit about the project that lies behind this in a minute, but more or less, this is a paper I've started a while ago. It got postponed for various things, not least the pandemic. And so it's really nice to have the opportunity to present it here and get some feedback. And in opening up the paper, one of the things I thought would be useful as a sort of visual starting point is this painting by Antonio Castro, which we came across, Camilo and I, when we were doing field work in El Paso and Juarez. And it shows the desertification of Juarez during the period of high levels of violence at the end of the first decade of the 2000s. And kidnapping was a big feature of that period. You had the emptying out of the public spaces, you have the businesses that you can see are closing, you have the feelings of insecurity pervading the community. And those sort of sentiments really are the backdrop to this paper. Because in talking about intimacy, as I'll explain, we're looking at intimacy in a much broader meaning, a more sociological meaning, where it extends much further than any notions of sort of emotional connections and co-presence into the community, into the lives, whether it's business or personal, of these communities. And so this is a starting point, and I'll talk more about the border setting. But there's two key underpinning assertions that I wanted to make before talking about specifics of the borderlands. And the first is that kidnapping as a research topic is an under-researched topic in terms of its significance. It's a Southern crime problem. Right? It might exist in the developed world with tiger kidnappings and the odd kidnappings between gangs. But when we look at it in the Southern context where it is most prevalent, we see high incidence, we see large numbers in certain settings, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's Colombia, whether it's Mexico, whether it's in some of the conflict zones in the Middle East. But it seemed to be, in my opinion, neglected academically. Maybe because it's a Southern topic, maybe also because there's an attention to transnational kidnappings of rich Westerners whether they're aid workers, journalists, or oil workers, when they get abducted in foreign regions. Or on the other hand, we have the dimension that it's elites that get kidnapped first. So the wealthy inevitably are the first wave of people who get kidnapped targeted for kidnapping, which then sort of creates a narrative around those elite groups, and so many more groups are affected. So I think it's an important topic, and one of the objectives we have with the project, and one of the objectives of doing research on this, is to try and bring more attention to it within criminology, but also within other disciplines. And in terms of thinking about it as a highly nuanced and contextualized issue, I just want to give a flavor of some of the dynamics at play within Mexico. one of our respondents, an asylum lawyer, said was that Mexicans have as many words for kidnapping as Eskimos do for snow, because there's so many different levels of it. So whether it's in a practical sense, a conceptual sense, or a temporal sense, kidnapping has multiple levels and mutations. You can be kidnapped for money, you can be kidnapped to work in the sex trade or the drugs trade, you can be kidnapped to be forcibly recruited into organized crime, kidnappings of journalists for intimidation, kidnappings between gangs because of debts that have to be paid or turf that's being fought over. These various different things, various different forms and motivations for kidnapping. But at another level, we have the conceptual dimension that we can think of kidnapping of individuals, but we can also think of kidnapping of space. There's a book by Kuhn called The Kidnapped City. It talks about how cities like Juarez, like Tijuana, like Culiacan have themselves been sort of held against their will by organized crime elements. And another dimension, just to show the Mexican context of how we need to have a very nuanced appreciation of kidnapping, is that kidnapping doesn't stand on its own as a form of crime. Someone can be kidnapped and then many of them are murdered, many are disappeared. Or we have situations in migrant smuggling where someone is held against their will to extract more money, where for all intents and purposes, it fulfills a lot of the criteria of kidnapping. So on multiple levels, it's complicated, and these complications vary depending on which the context we look at them and what's going on there. So that's a very important thing that I wanted to highlight from the outset, that we need to move beyond a sort of simplistic ransom narrative, as Jeremy Slack has put it, around kidnapping to appreciate all the different manifestations of this phenomenon. And then the other sort of underpinning for what I'm going to talk about is that intimacy is a core concept in this paper, and we need to understand it in a broader sociological sense. As I've indicated before, it's moving beyond sort of simplistic notions of emotional co-presence and proximity to take in things like shared knowledge, mutual action, the spatial relations, the interactions that exist within families, within businesses, within communities. So it's a much broader understanding of kidnapping that is being applied in this context regarding the impacts of kidnapping. So broader conceptualization of intimacy, but also a broader and more nuanced understanding of kidnapping. So those are sort of backdrop ideas that they'll sort of I hope will resonate through what I'm going to say over the next 30 minutes or so. So this work, what I'm presenting today, comes from a project, Mobile Solutions to the Mexican Kidnapping Epidemic, Beyond Elite Countermeasures Towards Citizen-Led Innovation. Now that was not going to make a nice acronym. So Ernesto, who works with me in the project, said, well, we'll make it make Mobile Solutions Against the Kidnapping Epidemic. Doesn't neatly fit, but it's worked for the project. And the project really came about Ernesto had worked on the disappeared in Mexico. I'd worked on security consultancies, which engaged in kidnap and ransom negotiations and resolutions. And we discussed the situation when we met randomly in Durham University about the situation of kidnapping in Mexico. And the whole project hinges on one key question. How do you counter kidnapping when you cannot access private solutions or rely on the state? Which is one of the big challenges, that as kidnapping has moved down from the sort of upper tiers of society to the middle and lower classes, that they confront this issue. They cannot insulate and isolate themselves through private security. They also can't lobby the state to protect their community or to try and resolve their cases. So what do those people, whether it's a taxi driver, a restaurant owner, people from these groups do to resolve the problem of kidnapping and to confront it in a context where there's high levels of corruption, impunity, and police have been implicated in a lot of cases of kidnapping? So the project had two key work packages: citizen-led counter-kidnapping, where Ernesto led on this part, and it was about developing tools to confront kidnapping. And then transborder effects and transnational solutions, which ties into what I'm going to present now. And in that context, we did 2 field visits to Tijuana and San Diego and Juarez and El Paso. We conducted 38 interviews in these transborder hubs. And we also did 11 interviews in Bogota and Medellin to look at what lessons we could learn from the Colombian experience as well. And when I say we, it was myself and Camilo Tamayo Gomez, who was the postdoc on the project. So in border context, immobility and intimacy. This is an image from one of the bridges that's spanning the Rio Grande between El Paso and Juarez. And it's a city and a trans-border location of contrast. The high levels of insecurity and violence in Juarez and the safety across the border in El Paso were pretty much beyond the huge institutions and structures and infrastructure of border control. You also have the presence of most of the security and intelligence agencies of the United States, as well as a military base. You have the affluence and security and stability of El Paso against contrasting situation in Juarez. And in this context of the border, kidnapping takes on new dynamics because it's a problem throughout Mexico, but it's a phenomenon that it ties up with mobility and immobility. So it's all about people being deprived of the freedom of movement, of being restricted in where they can go, being immobilized, but it also triggers mobilities and mobilizations itself. So ransom requests flow across the border. Kidnappings occur, transborder kidnappings. We have migrants who get kidnapped when trying to get into the United States. We have people who live a transborder life because of this insecurity. And we have cross-border private security supporting them. And then there's the mobilizations of actual protests against kidnapping, like the white protests when there's mass calls for action against this insecurity. So you have contrasting global north and global south settings. And then we have the issue of all of this being bound up with the intimacy-distance paradox, which is really the sort of the spine of this paper that I'm presenting today. Because what became apparent within the research was, in order for people to preserve their relations with, whether it's with their family and loved ones, whether it's with colleagues, whether it's with their business, they had to insert distance into those businesses to preserve the intimacy that existed there. And that will manifest itself in various different ways regarding the phenomenon of kidnapping that I will talk about now. So I've talked about the relationship between kidnapping and the border. And just briefly to demonstrate that, I just wanted to show some of the different transborder mobile subjects that are catalyzed and that also catalyze change in the dynamics of mobility in the border. So we have people who have money, who are restaurant owners, business people, who are able to access investor visas or dual citizenship to move across the border, lead a transborder life, and when needed, rely on private security to bring them across or keep them safe when they were in northern Mexico's borderlands. We have asylum seekers who have experienced kidnapping within Mexico, often at the hands of law enforcement, or law enforcement were implicated in their cases, that have then tried to use kidnapping as the basis for seeking asylum within the United States. The asylum seeker or the asylum lawyer that we talked to said that the actual process itself means that that they end up being kidnapped a second time because of the experience being so traumatic of the asylum processing. He said asylum processing is in itself a form of kidnapping. So this asylum lawyer took a bunch of cases that were to do with kidnapping and tried to use them with a degree of success, but generally these applications are not successful as a means to get these people away from the threat and across the border. We have undocumented migrants who during their precarious journeys into the United States are highly vulnerable to kidnapping. And so this is probably one of the most strong areas of literature and research by people like Gabriela Sanchez, Wendy Vogt, Jeremy Slack, Stephanie Lutert, and Caitlin Yates, who have looked at this phenomenon. And Yates and Lutert have talked about something like 250,000 kidnappings is their estimate between 2006 and 2018. So we're looking at kidnappings on an almost industrial scale regarding migrants. And of course, for the asylum seekers and the migrants who get deported back into Mexico, They're getting deported back into locations which they're unfamiliar with and where they're, again, prime candidates for kidnapping. So this is just a snapshot of the range of mobilities that link into kidnapping on the US-Mexico border. There's more beyond that, in the sense that the US has kidnapped people and brought them across the border. And this is something that actually through history links and provides a legal basis for extraordinary rendition years later. In the context of who got targeted by kidnapping in the border region, we see the vulnerabilities of a range of groups leading to them being targeted in different waves. And the very first wave of actors and business people that were targeted for kidnapping were doctors. Because along the border, there's a huge amount of medical tourism. People who do not have insurance within the United States, or you don't want to use their insurance, or want to be treated quicker, travel across to cities like Juarez, cities like Tijuana to receive treatment. This means that you have a wealthy professional class of doctors, you have surgeries that are very accessible, people who are easily identifiable, and these were one of the first groups to be targeted as a group for kidnapping. We have in 2008, 40 doctors were kidnapped in Tijuana. And the result of that was that surgeries become anonymized and securitized places, something that's almost the antithesis of what you'd imagine a doctor's practice or a surgery to be. Another area that was targeted was the restaurant industry, again, because of tourism, because of people traveling across the border and going out and enjoying the nightlife in Mexico. And speaking to the issue of the intimacy of this crime, and Ochoa's referred to kidnapping as an intimate crime, you have the situation where people who own the restaurants have the known leaders of cartels who are doing kidnapping, socializing in their restaurants. So in the case of Tijuana, a restaurant owner who we interviewed talked about how the Arellano Felix cartel were clients of theirs. They knew each other, and that was all going at the same time as people were being kidnapped. And that had knock-on effects of people moving the restaurants across the borders or managing them remotely. And then the factories, the maquiladoras on the border itself, we have owners who are US resident and who are relying on private security when they cross the border to secure their trips to conduct business. And so we have a wave of businesses that are amongst the first ones to be targeted by kidnappers, but it's extended beyond that. And again, as kidnapping moves through social classes, it becomes maybe the less well-off or less the upper middle classes to the middle classes that are getting targeted and the amounts being extorted dropping. So how did people react to this? And here we see the intimate life within these cities being affected. We have autocontention, where people self-isolate, they stay in their homes. The social life, the public space of the cities becomes damaged by the impact of kidnapping. We have people retreating into gated communities for those who can. So in Juarez, we encountered business leaders who had set up their own gated community with all the things we expect, multiple gates to get in, private security guards, and the vetting of anyone who is trying to buy a property there. We have the closing down of social circles and of social lives, people going out less, people not going to restaurants, as accentuated by the restaurants themselves closing and moving across the border. The obvious removals of visible displays of wealth and people starting to build security protocols into everyday practice. But it seeps further, and one of the researchers we interviewed, the quote from her at the bottom, she spoke about how she wouldn't take her son to the park in the city. And that was maintained now when we were interviewing her a couple of years ago. And she even explained to us that she had gained 25 kilos because of this sort of contained lifestyle of not wanting to socialize, not wanting to go out, not wanting to have the extra stress of going to the gym, doing exercise outside because of the insecurity in the border setting. So all of these things filter through into the erosion of the quality of life, the public space within these border cities. Turning in a more focused way towards intimacy, one of the biggest aspects in terms of the erosion of confidence and trust in Mexico is the treason phenomenon. So in the vast majority of cases, Ochoa estimates 70%. When we did training, security training before going to Mexico, we were told 80%. In those numbers of cases, 70, 80%, the person who's created the situation for the kidnapping to take place by passing information was someone known to the person who is kidnapped. And what this does is it creates paranoia within society. And this paranoia becomes accentuated in the border context by a phenomenon which was known as las listas. Now, many people talked about this, whether it was urban myth or reality, we couldn't prove. But the story here was that the kidnapping groups, on the condition of release, was that you gave up the name of others who are potential kidnapping targets. And what this means is the quotation at the bottom says that if my got, I'd be very frightened, would change my car for another one, I would do things. The danger is close to me because he knows me and is my friend. He loves me and everything, but he will talk because he will talk. I'm sure I would do it if I was in the same situation. I mean, I wouldn't blame him. So this continues even when kidnapping situations were resolved. People had to live with the thing that somebody that they knew or who knew them in some way was giving the information that led to them being targeted, which was about their wealth, their assets, or their mobility within the city. We also have kidnapping being actioned within negotiations itself, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But this phenomenon of las listas existed in Juarez and Tijuana in two different locations, that the kidnapping gangs were, the fear was that kidnapping gangs were composing lists of targets. And the thing that people definitely did not want was to be one of those who was on the target, to be part of the treason phenomenon that Ochoa refers to. In terms of the intimacy-distance paradox, which is in the title of the paper, the moment when this sort of idea crystallized was when you're interviewing this community worker in Juarez. And she's explaining how the kidnapping moves through the different social groups. And she said, and there was doctors kidnapped, and some of them, of course, the ransoms were paid, but they didn't come back. And she said at that point that her family made the conscious decision that they wouldn't pay a ransom if someone was kidnapped. They wouldn't pay the ransom because they didn't want to be the targets for repeat victimization, because this was another phenomenon that was happening. It wasn't just being targeted once. You might pay ransom, another attempt would be made to extort money further. And as she says in the part of the quotation at the bottom, that is at that point that she made the decision to take her kids and move across the border to the US. So to preserve the family unit, we see here a fatalism about what you would do if a kidnapping has occurred. And people did this thing of refusing to pay ransom to kidnappers. And also the decision to split the family across the border. So the children, and what usually happened was the children and the mother would move across the border to the United States. And the father usually would either stay or would travel back and forth. This was a phenomenon we met with a number of the families that we interviewed. What this led to then was what I call a TransBorder Secession. So Henderson has written about the United States and the sort of white flight from metropolitan areas into the suburbs of people getting in their SUVs and moving to suburbia because of they're feeling insecure. But in the context of the border and the threat within these northern borderlands, we have TransBorder Secession. We have what's called a megxodus, where 11% of the population of Juarez left, and most of that went to El Paso. So 50,000 was meant to have moved from Juarez to El Paso. This had a knock-on effect in that it was the entrepreneurial class, businesses, restaurants set up across the border. It gave El Paso great insulation from the global financial crisis at the end of the first decade of the 2000s, but of course it had negative effects on Juarez itself. The consequence of this is that you have what are called gilded colonies of Mexicans in places like Chula Vista, Otay Mesa, Otay Ranch, around San Diego, and others then within Juarez. There's an image in the bottom right of one of these communities, which was unironically called Enclave, that we came across when we were in Chula Vista in the United States. So these sort of privileged mobile elites are able to cross the border. They have expedited passes to cross the border. They can harness security when needed. They can harness even tracking of their cars, which have built-in units for talking to security consultant overseers when they do this. And so they are able to sort of remove themselves, and a sort of contrasting perspective on the border, where we hear all about the military border and the negative effects and the damage and harm that it does to migrants. But for a certain class, they were able to use the border to insulate themselves to a degree from the threat. Now, this didn't come at a cost. It came at the cost of severing, or at least diminishing, their ties with the family members and colleagues and businesses that were left behind, trying to manage those things remotely, as well as having the added stigma of having abandoned their home cities. So there's a difficulty of cultural adaptation when they moved across, and a lot of them stayed within that group of Mexicans that moved across, but also the feeling that they had abandoned the city that needed them and left others behind. And this, as the quote at the bottom says, takes a toll on the marriages, the relationships of those who do that as well. So they can attempt to reconstruct those bonds within that sort of expat community, but it's a challenge. The cost of security is the reduction of intimacy. And this extends to, like, what I've been talking about is the people who are well off and privileged, but there are those from less well off who even took the measures to send children across the school to El Paso to be educated because of the safety. And so if you go to UTEP, if you go to El Paso, you'll find a large amount of kids and students who cross the border to go to school. And in this case, this activist told us how her family would feel relieved when she was out of the city. This was during that violent period, because at least during those hours of the day, she was removed from the threat of violence. What they also said was, because people knew that she was across the border, they would receive virtual kidnapping phone calls. So people pretending that they had kidnapped her on the school across the border to try and verify that she was still there. So this sort of insecurity of the border even manifests itself in attempts to fraudulently extort people when there hasn't even been a kidnapping. The insecurity is such. So the TransBorder Secession and this notion of putting distance in the relationships to preserve the relationships was a strong feature that came through the field work. But we also see intimacy and distance playing out within the kidnap and ransom negotiations themselves. So what we find is that, as previously mentioned, kidnappers know things about their targets. So when they're trying to get as much money as possible in the ransom payment, they'll say, why don't you sell this car, the vintage car that your fella has parked in the garage? And then they go, okay, it's someone who knows our house, someone who knows what we have, who's giving this information away. But we encountered things that people wouldn't go to the local police. They wouldn't go to the anti-kidnapping unit in their vicinity. We had people from Tijuana who are hiring negotiators from Mexico City and reporting crimes in Mexico City because they were so scared that there would be the greater scope for there to be a reprisal. More people would know that they would be targeted, so they could be targeted again. And so there was distance even in who you hired to do the negotiation. The negotiators themselves, part of their skill is to try and slow down the process to make it less emotional. And the kidnappers, of course, they embrace tactics of silence and waiting and distance to try and increase the anxiety of the relatives of whoever's been kidnapped. We also have intimacy playing out in things like the sending of body parts as part of the negotiating process. So the body parts that can be tested for DNA, it may in some cases be the only thing that is left for the family members because they never see their relative again. So intimacy and distance continue to be a feature and play out within the negotiations themselves. Another sort of aspect that I wanted to flag is that, intimacy is eroded in the sense that the ripple effect of kidnapping is very far-reaching. It's not just that you pay a ransom or that your loved one is, maybe at the very least, is traumatized and comes back. At the worst, may never be seen again. But houses are sold, whole families contribute, businesses go bust, and people are made unemployed. Marriages break down, people move, and in our case, we encountered different people with different experiences, and it ranged from a mother and daughter the son had been kidnapped and disappeared, and they had experienced a triple victimization, because there was the kidnapping. Their belief was that it was state agents that had done the kidnapping, and then afterwards, when he didn't return, the allegation was, well, he was kidnapped because he was involved in organized crime and drug trafficking. So there's a stigma attached to those families who are affected by kidnapping, that on both sides of the border, the line is that the only people who get kidnapped are those who are involved in crime activities. So we heard this from US law enforcement, and we heard this from Mexican law enforcement when they're doing the field work. Now, in trying to combat that stigma of kidnapping, the letter which is on the slide here is by someone whose brother was kidnapped and had gone through multiple payments, had to flee the city. When fled, she wrote a paper to the local newspaper saying goodbye Tijuana. And this was like a call to action against it, to call out the authorities for having failed her family. But it sparked a reaction, was covered widely, but it was also a way of trying to reassert the honor of the family in the face of the allegations that swim around in these situations. And this sort of disinformation and the putting out the rumors that, well, why would we solve that case? Because this individual was involved in drug trafficking and organized crime anyway. So it's an attempt to sort of assert a different narrative about what had happened. And in that way, some of the damage that is done can be combated, but it's a very small impact regarding the harm that is done. So moving away from the specific paper, just to wrap up the presentation, what I wanted to do is say a little bit about the wider project, and in case anybody wants to know about that. So in the other work package that my colleague Ernesto Schwartz-Moran led on, we developed a graphic novel that synthesized a lot of the findings about kidnapping within Mexico and what people had done to try and combat it as ordinary citizens. We developed an app which it didn't pan out as nicely as we'd have liked to, but it was with a panic button, it was with different things. It was mainly as a useful tool, but also was a way to get people to talk about an issue and an insecurity that is pervasive, but also taboo. People don't want to talk about it. And we thought, well, if you have to input your plan of action, who would receive panic button notifications, you start processing and thinking about that crime and that possibility. And then we held a workshop where we tried to get the momentum towards a sort of a body of scholarship on the issue of kidnapping, but also all crimes, whether it's disappearances or crimes against migrants, linking violent absence, ambiguous loss, and precarious mobility. And then the other thing which got paused because of the pandemic was an impact acceleration project, where after this we said, well, we really got a sense that kidnapping was taboo, that the narratives around kidnapping were often ones of graphic violence, of huge traumas. And we also wanted to help people try and plan for what might happen if it was their family that was affected. So we came up with the idea that the telenovela soap opera could be a vehicle to approach a very serious and pervasive insecurity, but in an accessible way, where we synthesized ideas from the fieldwork into episodes that explore different types of kidnapping, things like the betrayal phenomenon, things like the insecurities, the virtual kidnapping. We had to pause after 3 episodes because of the pandemic, but we have 2 more on the border, and one other that we hope we'll be able to film at the future. And we'll be showing these within schools and universities in Mexico with the ambition that those young people can engage with this and then can engage with their families regarding these telenovelas. And as regards the app may not have been what we hoped it was, but Ernesto has been working on a video game that is much more accessible. I think is going to be launched very soon. That again tries this ambition to get people thinking about peer-to-peer security planning and what they would do if they were in a kidnapping incident. So when things, just to wrap up, I guess it's, for us in this project, it's been new ground. It's been a project that's about trying to combat a problem, trying to generate new innovations and new interventions. And I guess what we've left it with is the massive challenge of trying to help people when they cannot rely on the state, they cannot rely on criminal justice reforms to act anytime quickly. And this is replicated in other contexts that are affected by kidnapping. So the ambition is to start growing interest in the topic, forge a global criminology of kidnapping, start building links between other academics in this field, and bringing in academics who are from the context that are affected by this. So that's about 35 minutes. So I'll stop there, but I look forward to hearing any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Conor. That was super interesting. I will stop the recording. Oh, and Lucia's